Welcome to OK Miniatures. Last week I made a hot wire cutter DIY. With a hot wire cutter you can make a lot faster cuts than just using a knife and a square, but you still need something to help keep those cuts nice and straight. So this week I'm going to be making a guide. Start off, I looked for a nice, straight, fairly tall or wide piece of wood. Really you don't need a super tall piece of wood, but I wanted something 3 or 4 inches tall at least to make sure that if I have a taller chunk of foam, thicker chunk of foam that's thinner, it doesn't tip and become unsquare. This way also, if I would like to cut a piece of foam in half, I use half-inch thick foam, which isn't a lot of surface area if you stand it on end. So if you don't have a tall fence, if you just have a short one, it can bend over the fence and not be square. So I found this board that's probably 5 or 6 inches tall, and it's not perfectly flat, but it's pretty good. So I ended up chopping it in half. That gives me about 15 inches, which is very close to the width of my hot wire cutter table. You can make it longer than that. I don't really see a need to. It might be useful if you have really long pieces of foam that you're cutting, but it seems more likely to just be harder to store and get in the way more. After cutting them in half, I would recommend cutting a chunk out of one of them to fit around the main arm of the hot wire cutter. I did not do this, so I had to do it later, which made it a little bit more difficult, but just keep that in mind. Next, I cut some chunks of 2x4, just keeping them roughly the width of the wood. That way these can provide supports and strengthen the joint between the two pieces. Next, I just screwed the two boards together and used the 2x4s to hold everything together, and that was the basic functional version. Made sure to use countersink on the holes so that those screws were nice and flush and wouldn't catch on any foam or make the guide uneven. But after doing that, I checked it with a square and it was not square. The board needed to tip away from the 2x4s a little bit on the top, not the bottom. So I made sure the bottom was in as far as it could go, and then I unscrewed the top and wedged a washer in there to give it a spacer. And then I just kept checking, making sure that was pushing it down until it was square. Once it was square, I put the screw back in, made sure it was tight. For the other side, it also wasn't square, but I noticed that on this side, it wasn't square, but this board overhangs this board a little bit, making it uneven. So I actually ended up taping some washers to the corner until it wasn't wobbling. I also, after bringing this inside, noticed that this whole thing needed to shift a little bit more, so I added another washer on this side to make it square relative to my hot wire cutter table. And then, since I forgot to make a chunk earlier, I was going to use a jigsaw to cut this out. I couldn't find it though, so I drilled some holes and used a chisel to knock this chunk out. It's not the prettiest thing, but it is very functional, so that's good. Also, when you put these 2x4s on, leave a little bit of space here. This way you can clamp this end to the table of the hot wire cutter, and the clamp doesn't need to be super tall to reach over the 2x4 as well. Let's go see this guy in action. To hold this steady, I have just a clamp, which I forgot to mention in the last video, but I inset all the 2x4s from the edge of the table here so that it's a nice surface for the clamp to grab to all the way around. So I'm gonna get this set up to cut some 3-inch squares. We'll see how that goes. I have this square that has this nice flat surface, which I plan to use as like a crosscut jig. I put some foam under here just to keep it nice and not tippy. So we'll see how that goes. That's pretty beautiful. About 5 minutes and I got 8 nice little tiles cut. Beautifully square, except that starting edge wasn't quite straight. But really, I think the cross-cut part is only necessary for that first straight cut, and then once you got a square edge, you can use this guy again. Super easy to make, incredibly useful. Will definitely make modular tiles so much easier to make. Overall, I'm really happy with how this turned out. This board isn't perfectly flat, so noticing that if I put a square up against it, it's flush until about these screws and then it curves this way. I'm okay with that. I would caution you against a board that curves out, since if you put your square down here to measure to the hot wire cutter to get a certain dimension piece, if this curves out, the foam won't necessarily be able to sit flat against here, and it could end up cutting a lot smaller or on an angle. That's just something to be aware of. I don't foresee any major issues because of it, as long as I keep that in mind. If you found this video helpful, please hit the thumbs up, consider subscribing. If you'd like to see the hot wire cutter, how to make one for yourself, check out this video, and with that, I'll see you in the future.